So I have a big problem with the UFC right now, and I've been watching this sport for over a decade. I've been doing YouTube on it, covering MMA for over a year now, and I really do feel like the UFC is in one of its darkest spots it's ever been in a long, long time. Now, when I say this, I obviously don't mean that the UFC hasn't grown as a sport over the past decade. It definitely has become a bigger name in terms of comparing itself to the NFL, NBA. Not on that level just yet, but in terms of who's coming in and who's watching the UFC, that number has grown tremendously. What I'm referring to is the quality of events that we get and the quality of the champions that we have. And when I look at these names and champions, I don't really see that next guy who could be a Conor McGregor. And there might never, ever be a Conor McGregor ever again. But I at least want somebody who can have that torch. And maybe it won't be as big of a flame that Conor McGregor had, but at least it's a flame in itself. And with Sean O'Malley losing at UFC 306, I feel like this is the climax of the darkest age of the UFC. Now, in the future, I might do a whole documentary about how I feel about the UFC and how I claim this to be the dark age of the UFC, but I kind of want to do a quick rundown in this video and just talk about my overall feelings. I'm going to rant a little bit. This is going to be a rant style video and just kind of give you my overall take of the current landscape of the UFC. So I think my biggest claim to why the UFC is not really good right now is that we don't really have any big names. And if we do have some big names, they don't really fight too often. The only exception to this rule is Alex Pereira. Pereira is carrying the UFC on its back right now, and nobody else really is. And I thought Ilia Topuria could be that guy who could be exciting and be a big name and be a future star in the UFC, but he's not fighting too often. And we need guys who have big names, who do produce exciting fights, to fight often a lot. And that's a big issue that I have with some certain fighters is that they get a big name, they have a big KO, they get an easy win with no damage involved, and they don't fight for 6, 7, 8 months at a time. And I feel like that's a huge detriment to their name and to the product that they could provide for the UFC. One prospect that's in my head right now is Peyton Talbot. He just got a finish over Giannis Gamori in the first round fairly quickly, took no damage, landed like 2 punches and KO'd him. And he hasn't fought in, I believe, the past 3, 4 months. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's been quite a long time since we've seen Peyton Talbot get a fight booked. And when I see Peyton Talbot, the guy is oozing with confidence. The guy is the next big name, the next big star at bantamweight, and he needs to fight more often. And that's not just on Peyton Talbot. I'm just kind of giving you an example. There are a plethora of fighters in the UFC, like Ilia Topuria, who do have a big name, who do get crazy KOs, and don't fight often enough. Now, I do get it. Maybe after a war, you want to take some time off. If you take any damage in your fights, if you have some injuries after a fight, you need some time off to recover. And even sometimes, if you're at the top of the rankings, it can be hard to get a fight booked versus somebody because maybe the timetables don't line up with what I mentioned before. But again, some of these fighters take a more political route to getting their title shot. And I feel like that's just really bad for the UFC. When I see some guys fighting once, twice a year and not taking too much damage and they're sitting out to fight the next top guy, it's more of a way for them to get towards the belt easier, and they're kind of taking the easy route, which is fine, which is good for their career, and I do urge fighters to look out for themselves. However, when it comes to an entertainment product and how it affects us fans, it does negatively impact us. Right now, all I'm thinking about is what if Ilia Topuria already fought 2 more times this year? He would already be a bigger name than what he is right now. Look at Alex Pereira. He has single-handedly propelled his name to absolute stardom, doesn't even speak any English because he's an active fighter, already has a fight booked versus Khalil Roundtree, already KO'd Jamal Hill this year. And that's really what I'm talking about. I feel like Alex Pereira should be the standard for UFC fighters and UFC champions. And this is also one of the gripes that I have with the whole fighter pay argument, because if these fighters weren't getting paid enough, they would be fighting more often. And if you are a fighter, maybe on your first, second contract, and you want to get more money, just fight more. Look at Kevin Holland when he first came into the UFC. Kevin Holland fought 5 times in his first year in the UFC and made a boatload of money. Andre Fialho, who is now cut from the UFC, fought a bunch of times in his debut in the UFC, made a whole bunch of money, got a second contract. Now he's cut because he's lost like 4 fights in a row, got chinned. It is what it is. That can be the negative outcome of that. But still, he made a bunch of money, got fight of the night bonuses, got performance of the night bonuses because he fought early and often enough. And some of these fighters complain about how they don't get paid enough, when they're only fighting once or twice a year. And I'm like, well, that's the reason why. You've only fought 3 times in the past 5 years. Of course, you're going to be a little bit broke because you're not doing your job. Your job is to fight, and that's how you get paid. So bringing this all back, I think it does benefit the fighters more and benefit the UFC more and benefit us as fans more if we do see fighters fighting more often, which should be the case, but it's not. The biggest risk in that case is for the fighters. Obviously, they're the ones going out there and putting their bodies on the line. But I think if they want to be successful in the UFC and make some money and become a champion, I think fighting more often is what they need to do. And since not fighting and holding out and waiting for the next best matchup is kind of the new standard for the UFC fighters, I think it really makes it hard for the UFC to put on good fight nights and good pay-per-views sometimes. And don't let some of the good cards we've had this year fool you. UFC 300 was an objectively amazing card, but before 300 and after 300, we had some pretty stinky fight nights because the UFC boatloaded that whole card and we couldn't put anybody else on the surrounding cards in that month or 2 month span. So now we're at the point with the UFC, for them to put on a good card, they have to make all the other fight nights and other pay-per-views around it pretty shitty because they need to load up and get as much good fighters and good talent and big names on one singular card. And that's one of my biggest concerns for the UFC right now. Maybe it's always been like that, and since I'm now doing content, I've just realized that. But I feel like that's just not how this sport really should work. Sometimes it does make sense for fighters to not fight. I do understand that. But I think there's too many fighters on the roster just not fighting because they just don't want to fight, or they're basically trying to manage their career the best way possible, which is good for them, but I think bad for us and for the UFC. Now let's get into the big meat and potatoes of this argument, the whole champion part of this. We're seeing a lot of grappling champions recently, and I want to kind of, I guess, dive into that a little bit. So let's talk about Merab Dvalishvili. Obviously, he's the most recent one, the biggest one right now. He just beat Sean O'Malley at 306. I firmly don't believe that Merab is going to be a big name champion in the UFC ever in his career. His grappling style sometimes cannot be entertaining to watch. When he fought Jose Aldo, that was abysmal. He just clinched him for 3 rounds and won by points. And that's pretty much the whole narrative when it comes to these grappling champions for the most part. They just clinch, hold up. They basically score points by using control time, and it's not really that entertaining to watch. Now, I can already see the comments. Some of them are going to be saying, if you don't like wrestling, go watch boxing, go watch kickboxing, go watch Muay Thai. It's not even just that. Grappling in the UFC can be entertaining. I go back to the Arman Tsarukyan versus Mateusz Gamrot fight. That was entertaining grappling. I also think about whenever Volkanovski grappled people, he would go for vicious ground and pound. Volkanovski is the king of full guard ground and pound right now in the UFC. Whenever he took down Brian Ortega, he would posture up, stand up on his feet, and just lay down heavy ground and pound and full guard. That is entertaining grappling. And so when I see that, I now understand that fighters in the UFC can make grappling entertaining. It can be fun to watch. So my problem isn't with grappling itself, it's how fighters are using grappling to win fights. Fighters in the UFC have now resorted to basically scoring points by holding a body lock against the cage, kneeing the thigh, getting into half guard and landing pitter-patter shots, landing really nothing too damaging on opponents, not going for submissions. We don't ever see Merab go for a serious submission. It's just not a thing that he does. He likes to hold you against the cage and land his knees to the thigh, get in full guard, land his total strikes, and just score points that way. And that to me just really isn't entertaining to watch. I feel like UFC grapplers should be going into a fight to actually fight. And now it's not really turned into fighting anymore. It's turned into how can I score points the best? Which again, for a fighter standpoint, is probably the best thing for their career. But again, as an entertainment thing, when fans come to watch UFC, when new casual fans come to buy a pay-per-view, they want to see people get knocked out. They want to see people going through wars. They want to see people taking damage, and that is kind of the name of the game. That is what has propelled the UFC to becoming as big as it is right now, is just chaos sometimes and just good entertaining fights and good striking and good grappling and damage. that is what makes the sport so great. There's also narratives that we have and trash talk that can bolster that and make fights bigger than what they are just naturally. But now we just have fighters trying to win by points, just by holding body locks, holding full guard, not doing too much damage, trying to score points by using control time. And that to me just isn't entertaining. And it feels like what the majority of the champions now are kind of that way. We have at Pantoja at flyweight, who can do that scoring points, grappling up style. He's more aggressive on the feet. I like Pantoja sometimes, but he can be boring at times when he wants to grapple. We now have Merab at bantamweight doing that. Topuria doesn't fight too often. Islam can be boring sometimes whenever he is on the ground with people doing that point scoring style. Bilal Muhammad at welterweight is kind of the same way, just getting takedowns and holding body locks. Bilal Muhammad is not known for doing any damage whatsoever. Again, hasn't had a finish in I don't know how long. He can really only win by decision. Drix du Plessis at middleweight. He can be inciting on the feet. I think he's one of the good ones, actually. I mean, Pereira, obviously, at light heavyweight, which is good. And John Jones at heavyweight, he's going to retire soon. But Tom Aspinall, I think, is good. So it feels like at least maybe half, maybe more than half of the champions have something that is not good for the UFC in them. I think the only ones that are actually benefiting the UFC right now is like Dricus, Tom Aspinall, and Pereira. That's really it. Every single other champion right now is either doing that point grappling style or they're just not fighting often enough. And that's what really sucks about the UFC right now. And just to even get off the whole grappling point, it's not even just grappling that's boring. It can also be striking in the UFC. We have some pretty boring strikers in the UFC as well. I look at Ian Gary right now. He can make a fight really, really boring on the feet. When Leon Edwards was champion, he could be boring on the feet as well. He was a big point fighter when it came to striking. So it seems like when to be UFC champion, you have to be boring in some sort of aspect. We can't have any sort of exciting champion right now in the UFC. Either you're a grappler, has a boring style, or you're a striker and you have a boring style. So it seems like these champions just aren't really entertaining nowadays in the UFC, and that's a big I don't know. Maybe it's always been like this, and now I'm just coming to the realization that the UFC is susceptible to this sort of thing. I don't really know. I'm just kind of really looking at it through a lens here and seeing like Marab and Bilal winning the championships in the past two pay-per-views. And I'm just like, why? Why is this becoming more common of a thing to have these guys who, yes, are good? I do believe that the best fighters in the world should be champion. It just sucks that these champions aren't really that entertaining and they won't sell pay-per-views, they don't have big names, and they don't really help out the UFC that tremendously. Because at the end of the day, I want this sport to grow. If the UFC grows, likely my channel grows with it, and it's just doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon. I don't know. But I don't know. That's pretty much my whole rant for the day. If you enjoyed this video, give me a like, subscribe, bell icon for notifications. I'm out of here, guys.